will be on the episode The Muffin Tops. So for students, any particular character or scene where you would like to start?
Good morning.
We just opened up the discussion about the Muffin Tops, so you don't have to log on.
Oh,
We're live.
okay.
Any particular scene and any character?
Well, Kramer was interesting the entire episode.
What's going on with Kramer? So we do have some medical students live in the room, so just in case you can't hear them, I am not talking to myself. So the comment was made about Kramer. Everybody could hear me okay, right? No audio? Okay, wait. All right, let's try this. We are having problems with the audio, so let's see if this helps here. Good morning. We're live, by the way, here. Is the audio working now? We're good now. All right, we're live. So we're just opening up today's discussion on the Muffin Tops. We've identified Kramer, that's with an M, as a character of interest this morning. What did you see? What do you want to talk about pertaining to Kramer?
Well, I think in a prior episode, probably, he'd given part of his life story to be written as part of this other comedian's autobiography. So then throughout the episode, he was having this weird identity crisis where I'm like, am I myself or am I this? I'm this comedian is me. So he goes to like book signing, then he starts this weird bus tour where he's talking about his own life, but as this comedian.
Mm-hmm. So the comment focused on Kramer's, the observation that when he sells his history to Peterman, he loses his sense of identity. And I think in large part that speaks volumes with regard to our cumulative experiences, certainly starting in childhood, building personality, right? Personality development starts in childhood. Freud even said that. He also believed personality development stopped in adolescence. Subsequent theorists have opposed that and otherwise proposed that there is development through the life cycle. So when we think of identity, that word is actually used by a psychosocial theorist named Erik Erikson. And every now and then, Erikson's theory does pop up on shelf exams, very infrequently, but it sometimes can. For Erikson, the main idea here as it pertains to Cosmo Kramer is that identity is a conflict that is resolved at or about the time of young adulthood. Right? We figure out who we are during young adulthood. Leading up to that point, the first few stages of Erikson's psychosocial stage theory include a sense of basic trust, followed by autonomy, and then industry. Number 4 would be identity, right? And even though I think I mentioned young adulthood, it's really adolescence. Right? So from Kramer's perspective, if he's struggling with identity, there might be something about, if it is clinically significant, his having had a conflict during adolescence and therefore regressing back to the time of that conflict. And that would be per Erik Erikson. Again, basic trust, followed by autonomy, followed by industry, and then finally, in this case, stage 4, per Erikson, identity. That's adolescence. We also know, we'll cheat, that Cosmo Kramer has a distant relationship with his mother. She left him, and Larry David really never tells us exactly when that occurred. So one of the things a psychiatrist, I think, would inquire about is if that neglect occurred at or around the time of adolescence, which would help explain why Kramer regresses back to adolescence. So all this is prompted by a current stressor, and that's his selling his history to Peterman, and then subsequently Kramer losing his identity. Any thoughts or questions with regard, or further observations?
I think there was a point that George Costanza makes, which kind of brings it together. He says Kramer doesn't know what's real. He says, is this the real? He has a sequence of reals in a sentence.
Yeah. So, and of all people, for George to have the insight with regard to what Kramer's struggles are in this particular episode, that makes sense. When you lose who you are and you're not sure what defines you, you could be existentially lost. And even George picks up on that. Now, George's comment may also come from a place where Kramer has always kind of oscillated between real life and a fictional world that he exists in. He never demonstrates true psychosis per se, but he does have what theorists usually refer to as that autistic retreat into a fantasy world that defines the defense mechanism of fantasy. Again, when Kramer developed that, likely around 2-3 years of age, when a lot of children develop fantasy play, including imaginary friends, tea parties, etc. But at some point, the child turns that off. Kramer never does. So from that respect, George can be, because George and he are friends, they know each other for a while, George may be referring to that aspect of Kramer as well. Any other thoughts about Kramer? Any other observations?
I was struck by, and I think this is just a different perspective, but I saw his whole thing on insisting on sitting in on Peterman's book signing and taking credit for, continuing to take credit for the stories. It's just an issue of personal boundaries. And I saw that issues of personal boundaries felt like a theme to me in this episode, with like George putting on the clothes of the person whose bag he was watching, and even a little bit of a professional boundary issue with Elaine and this venture capitalist who wants to take on the Muffin Tops situation.
Yeah, and that's a fairly pervasive theme, not only for these characters and among these characters, but also for this situational comedy as a whole. These four friends, I think, consistently violate what many of us would deem to be socially acceptable, especially boundaries. And that's something yet again explored in the Muffin Tops. There's no doubt about that. And in a way, and I'm not really sure where that comes from. Certainly, again, as a psychiatrist, we think, generally speaking, early childhood experiences. But that said, I think that with that in place, Kramer's crisis of not knowing who he is manifests the way it does. Whereas if he did have respect for others' boundaries and he was able to read social cues, his crisis is likely to manifest differently. So I think that's where we can kind of combine these two observations with regard to how this loss of sense of self is actually manifest in this character. And it's manifest in the way that it is. It's manifest in the way that we observed, largely because of other personality variables, including his poor boundary formation and his violation of boundaries and social cues. Any other characters caught your interest? You mentioned George. What's going on with George in this episode?
I thought it was really interesting when George, when he meets Marianne, and then she's like, you wouldn't last you didn't last here in New York, and then he like goes off and fakes his apartment and puts it in boxes to look like he is making it out here in the city. And it's like, you would think it's just to get Marianne to like respect him or something, but I think it's like something more than like him trying to prove, like really assume this identity and prove himself, like really, and then it's kind of coming from an angry place or justification ego kind of, I thought, which was when I thought about it more than just getting the girl,
Yep. So the observation here is about George and his interaction with Marianne and the comments that she makes, and then perhaps most importantly, George's reaction to those comments. And I think there's a couple of things here. Number one, Marianne's comment exists in a vacuum. Now, if we saw the prequel, if she had been in prior episodes and she does this to everyone, then we're talking about something different. But we don't have evidence of that. So for sake of discussion, let's assume that that is not who Marianne is per se. So what she does, to the extent that it does operate in a vacuum, it has a parallel in psychiatry, and that's when either as a clinician or even a researcher, we're blinded. She was not influenced by prior knowledge that George lived in Manhattan. Her observation, including first meeting him, initial impression because of what he was wearing, was actually quite the opposite. So there may have been some truth with regard to this city eating you up. And I wonder if, because she was blinded, and perhaps, and unbiased, those impressions are real, meaning they're valid. If we look at George Costanza and what happens to him over 9 seasons of the situational comedy, he struggles. And I wonder if in an alternate universe, if he had lived, let's say, in New Jersey, he would be a different person. He'd be less stressed. He'd be less anxious. He might have other stuff going on. Present company may actually not. But the fact is that she might be right. And if she is, I think a significant component or factor is her actually being unbiased or blinded. So there's a parallel here. And from a clinical perspective, that is a clinical pearl, we have to go into these interviews with people that are struggling, anxiety, depression, or otherwise, blinded as well. When we do that in a clinical venue, we call it unconditional positive regard, right? So I think she actually represents that. The other thing to, I think, take from this is George's reaction. She held up a mirror to him, and I think she told him a truth that he, number one, probably never heard before, and number two, probably is in denial about. And I think his reaction has a lot to do with that. So again, this is linked to her being unbiased and honest, and he had difficulty hearing it. Right? And then you see his reaction as a result. He needs to prove her wrong. He really has very little motive other than the need to prove that she's wrong, because what she actually tells him, it is honest, unbiased, and likely valid.
I think if we're like sticking to the theme of identities throughout this episode, and like where like Kramer has his identity crisis, like George also is playing around with his identity or trying to figure out like, am I really a New Yorker? Like, do I fit in with this mold of like their identity of what a New Yorker is? Because him just changing his outer appearance immediately made everyone regard him as an outsider.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting that the theme of identity plays in multiple characters.
Yeah. The comment is that it brings us back to the theme of identity and how what happens with George and his interaction with Marianne parallel the experience of Kramer. There's definitely a parallel there. Yeah. Any other characters you'd like to discuss this morning? We're discussing the Seinfeld episode, The Muffin Tops.
The last scene of Jerry in the moonlight was very funny.
So the reference was to the final scene with Jerry in the moonlight. So what happens?
This whole concept of the werewolf is becoming another character. His animal side is coming out, and he's trying to hide it from his girlfriend.
Yeah. So it's certainly an allusion to the werewolf, right? Where the root in Latin, man, the man wolf, right? Someone who's part man and part animal. So I think with regard to where this goes, I mean, there's a lot to unwrap here. We can literally have an entire clerkship dedicated to the folklore behind the werewolf. But that said, it starts out with discussing again, werewolf, man, the superego, and then wolf, the animal side, which is the id. And the struggle all of us have subconsciously with regard to what we would like to do, governed by our id, which operates along what is referred to as the pleasure principle, always in conflict with what we're allowed to do. And that's the superego, which itself is guided by the reality principle. And these two sides of ourselves, were and wolf, will never, ever coincide. They will be equal and opposite all the time. And Freud called the friction between that anxiety. Right? So for Jerry's character, he is an anxious person to the extent that we identify what we see in the moonlight as the battle between what he wants to do and what he will allow himself to do, the id versus the superego. Any other thoughts about, and I just want to go off on a little bit of a tangent here, the actual mythological character of the werewolf? What happens when our superego is fractured or it's weak and our id impulse comes to conscious expression or awareness and then expression at times or episodically?
Become impulsive.
Right? The word impulsive is going to be actually discussed, right? And matter of fact, those wants, those desires, those thoughts, feelings, etc., that actually make up our primal id are all referred to as impulses, right? So all of the above are under the header of impulses. So the id, that aspect of our subconscious, is the warehouse of our impulses. And the only reason why we are not acting impulsively now is because we all have intact superegos. But when the superego is weakened, we actually can see this manifest. And one area of illness that we then discuss, that is one set of illnesses that I think the werewolf prompts discussion of, are the impulse control disorders. Now, with regard to focusing on this clinically, not all impulsive behavior that is clinically significant is due to an impulse control disorder. Matter of fact, in the prior revision of the DSM, the DSM-4, it was made clear in the title of the chapter, impulse control disorders not elsewhere classified, or NEC. And by the mere framing of that title, that was the chapter's title, the clinician was reminded to always investigate any larger disorder that might account for these episodes of impulsivity. Two that come to mind quickly include bipolar disorder and antisocial personality disorder. If a patient of yours presents with clinically significant impulsivity, with a pre-existing condition such as bipolar disorder, if you are going to make the diagnosis of an impulse control disorder, your case formulation must justify why their impulsive acts aren't due to that pre-existing condition. Right? And it's possible, but that's where your case formulation must be directed. Otherwise, it would be reasonable to assume that conditions like bipolar, for example, would certainly explain acts of impulsivity, in as much as that is actually a diagnostic criterion of mania. Right? Matter of fact, if you've watched any films about the werewolf, especially the older films, black and white, Lon Chaney, the idea of bipolar disorder is actually discussed in the film. So it brings this very idea of impulsive behavior